Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History, the podcast that takes you into all the most important, impactful, but controversial events in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. Hello and welcome. My name is Derek Taylor, your host for this podcast. Thank you once again to all my listeners. I seem to have a lot of new listeners recently. I've been doing some advertising on Facebook, and that's probably why. If this is your first time listening, welcome. You can find Controversies in Church History on various platforms, Facebook, YouTube, as well as Spotify for podcasters, and I'm my host for the podcast, Twitter, and on Patreon. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast and help out and defray some costs for what I do here, please think about doing that. But also available on pretty much any other platform you can think of, Apple Podcasts, and so on and so forth. This is a short, brief episode. I thought I'd drop this one for our general listeners. That is on my mind for the last few weeks. And if you pay attention to the news, there's been a big row recently over the comments of Cardinal Robert McElroy. Robert McElroy, the Cardinal Bishop of San Diego. I think it's Cardinal Bishop of San Diego. A protege of Pope Francis, has been making the arguments from the early part of the year in America magazine. America is the Jesuit magazine in the United States. Excuse me. And basically trying to make the argument that, for what he calls radical inclusion. And if you followed this, you know what this is. This is basically an attempt to in practice, undermine the church's teaching that both homosexual acts, but acts outside of sexual acts outside of marriage. Pardon me, I forgot how to speak when I started doing this. Sexual acts outside of marriage are sinful. And a lot of people have jumped on this. I won't. There are plenty of people better at the theology than me. One of the things I want to point out is he gave an interview a few weeks ago, another one as a response to critics. And one of the things that he's got several arguments, none of them I think are very good. But one of them in particular is my expertise. He basically says that the church did not teach until the 17th century. I'll read the actual paragraph here. Did not teach that sexual sins outside of marriage were basically automatically wrong. Let me read the passage from his. This is March 7th, I believe. March 2nd, responding to critics. And this is the paragraph that caught my eye. For most of the history of the church, says Cardinal McElroy, various gradations of objective wrong in the evaluation of sexual sins were present in the life of the church, but in the 17th century, with the inclusion in Catholic teaching of the declaration that for all sexual sins there is no parvity of matter, i.e. no circumstances can mitigate the grave evil of a sexual sin, we relegated the sins of sexuality to an ambit in which no other broad type of sin is so absolutely categorized. Unquote. He goes down and doubles down on this a few lines later. It is precisely this change, quote, it is precisely this change in Catholic doctrine made in the 17th century that is the foundation for categorically barring LGBT and divorced or married Catholics from the Eucharist. Does the tradition that all sexual sins are objectively mortal make sense within the universe of Catholic moral teaching? Unquote. Now, several people have pounced on this, and rightfully so. There's a good article doing this in Catholic World Report by Larry Schapp. He's a theologian. He gives him a beating that he deserves for this stuff, because this is really, really. I don't think. Again, I don't like to accuse people of dishonesty, but I think he's out and out just lying. McElroy seems like an educated person. This is not true. There are lots of things here. I need to point this out. I'm going to go a little into detail about his historical strategy here, but the church had always thought that sins were really serious and that some of them were just intrinsically wrong no matter what you do. Schapp in his essay mentions Aquinas, Augustine, their other church fathers. Maybe it wasn't unanimous everywhere, every single minute prior to the 17th century, but it's a pretty good consensus, I'm imagining. And to give you an idea, again, one of the things you have to understand about all this, when we say, these things are objective sins. You have to understand that the early church definitely had a sort of moral perfectionist view on things like sexuality. That is to say, they thought you could be perfectly sexually continent. There was this idea current in the 4th century, shared by Pope Siricius. It was a pope in the 390s, well as Saint Jerome, that the idea that there was, in the Old Testament, there was partial virginity and continence, but is fulfilled in the New Testament with perfect continence. And so there's an expectation that all serious Christians should seek, or at least desire, perfect sexual continence. Other words, they took literally the words of Christ in the gospel, "Be ye therefore perfect," and literally the words that, of course, if you even think about committing adultery with someone, you've already done it. In other words, they recognize that the New Testament has a sort of ratcheting up of the standards for sexual morality. And not only that, there is a positive element of this. Again, this is where monasteries come from. There is this, move to abandon the world and go out into monastic communities, partly because people want to pursue what Origen called the angelic life. Because why? And this is the thing here, is that, and again, this goes back to Christ's words in the gospel. If you recall, I know this is in Matthew and Mark, but his interchange with the Sadducees, the woman had 7 husbands, and which one will be her husband in the afterlife. Remember what Christ says is, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know the scriptures, the power of God, because in heaven they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. That's where the idea, that's where the term, that's where Origen got that phrase from, the angelic life, I presume, referring to monasticism. That means that our ultimate eternal destiny is not sexual. Nobody's going to be nobody's going to be having sexual intimacy in the afterlife for all of eternity. So there'd be no point to all this. That's the point, by the way, of all that massive emphasis on continence. Now, of course, again, historically speaking, the great zeal of the early church wanes, right? Especially when it moves from the Roman Empire out into Northern Europe. And at various times and various places, the church has been in practice. Yeah, of course, they don't expect every single person to be a saint. The vast majority of people who ever lived and ever will live are not going to be achieving perfect continence or being that sort of perfect chastity that still is, I think, the ideal for all Christians. But that they took it deadly seriously. Again, people debate about this because, the sources are kind of sketchy. If you don't know, the idea that you do penance, right? You go to confession, you cite out a list of sins, is thought to have originated in the 6th century in Ireland, because you had these monasteries there, these Celtic monastic missionary type orders there, and they wrote these books for people in mission territory, people that were new to the teachings of the church. They were called penitentials. We have these books. And they list a laundry list of offenses treated that are sinful, and I won't go into all. I guess maybe I will. They mention all sorts of sexual things in there. I won't go into them, but pretty much anything you can think of is basically condemned as a sin there. And even, of course, within marriage, certain types of sexual, I won't go into it, certain types of sexual acts are even a sinful there. And again, I'm talking about practice here because no one's ever doubted that was the church's teaching, if you mean in principle. And I say this to go back to McElroy's response here. When he says this, that the sleight of hand, I really hate this, the way people do this. Where is this at? Let me find the actual. So this is his paragraph here where he says, but in the 17th century, with the inclusion in Catholic teaching of the declaration that for all sexual sins there is no poverty of matter. And you see what he's doing there is basically he's saying that, well, because there was no formal declaration that this was the case before the 17th century, it had never been a teaching before then. And it's this very, 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 I just think it's dishonest, sleight of hand. The church doesn't have to spell things out in a dogmatic definition. It doesn't normally do so until it's been challenged. And that's why there are so few until you get to the modern era, and I think we have probably too many. But I don't hear that's a real really devious sleight of hand. And again, if you don't know the history of this stuff, and again, I'm not an expert, but I know enough to know that he clearly is trying to blur the line between practice and faith itself, and saying, "Hey, we made these changes in the past, therefore we can change it again now." And it's just not the case. I mean, he's just being kind of dishonest about it. And I hate to say that, but I can't see anybody who doesn't know that this isn't the teaching, that it isn't the core of it this way. And this is, again, part of his, and again, he mentions this in that other paragraph. It is precisely this change in Catholic doctrine made in the 17th century that is the foundation for categorically barring LGBT and divorced married Catholics from the Eucharist. This whole idea, by the way, this introducing, the term LGBT into Catholic discourse like this, again, as I just mentioned, is totally opposed to what the faith teaches. Again, your ultimate, this idea, by the way, that your sexuality is the core of your identity. When, again, our destiny is to be with God for all of eternity, where we're never having sex again, right? We don't need to reproduce in heaven, and all the intimacy, and of course, sexuality has to do with intimacy. All that will come from God Himself, as far as I understand this in the afterlife. And so all of this is just, again, you knew this. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably know all this, but it's something to note here. The sleight of hand. It's a common sort of trope, rhetorical trope, where they seize upon this. Again, I have no idea. He doesn't give any specific examples when he says this declaration. I'm assuming he's referring to some sort of document. Larry Schapp, in his essay, thinks he's referring to Jesuit moral casuistry in the 17th century, which presumably I think he's talking about the criticisms from the Jansenists. And I actually have a podcast on the Jansenists. It was kind of popular too. People liked it. They're the ones that criticized heavily a lot of Jesuit casuistry as excusing sexual sin, and they changed it. And I think that's maybe what he's referring to there. But in no way, shape, or form, in principle, has the church ever affirmed what he's affirming. In practice, again, they've tolerated things. I may actually do an episode on this at some point. Again, I mentioned, when Western Christianity left the Roman Empire, in particular in the days, for example, of Charlemagne, where you had this idea of perfect continence and everything. Emphasis on celibacy, right? That was a thing. That's been a tradition in Rome since the 4th century. This is kind of lost, and so there's a widespread clerical marriage. Those sorts of excesses. They curb them over time. Eventually, the Gregorian reformers actually undo this. But even in marriage in general, because you have people like Charlemagne, right, who's essentially a warlord. He's got multiple wives, and so you have these periods where it's just not possible for the church to enforce, in a lot of ways, its dogmas and everything. But no one has ever, in principle, said, "Yeah, it's okay. You can have several wives. Yeah, it's okay. That'll work that way." And this is a fairly common tactic of people like of Cardinal McElroy's ilk. But you should not be fooled by his history, which, as Schapp mentions, is dubious history. It's not real. He's just throwing it out there and trying to fool people. So I thought I would make a little short episode and just remind everybody the specifics of why this is baloney and why you shouldn't listen to it. So that's all for this episode. A couple other things about upcoming episodes. A couple should be later in the week. One, I'm going to have a book review, a very interesting one on the, we'll get to it in a few days, and as well, the second episode of the series on Latinization is also coming. So, and those will both be for subscribers to begin with. So if you want to get early access, go to Patreon page and become a patron. Not that expensive. But otherwise, it'd be a few weeks before those drop for y'all. But anyway, any case, that's what's upcoming. Thank you guys for listening. If you, again, like this, go to the website. I have a website. I forgot my website, churchcontroversy.com. I have, blog posts there and everything else. Maybe some other little stuff coming in the future from that website. Facebook, go like the Facebook page. Please subscribe on YouTube. I'm monetize the channel, need more subscribers, so go do that if you like the podcast in general. Please follow me on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Please leave messages and comments. I try to get back to them. Some people I haven't gotten back to yet. I have some people just leave nasty messages on my on my Facebook page. Sometimes I don't respond to those, but any constructive things I'll definitely respond to if you have them. Or go to Spotify. Please tell people about the podcast. That's the big thing. I'm trying to get the word out and trying to advertise a little more. May take out a few more ads here in the next month in some other Catholic spaces. Try to get the word out. So in any case, thank you everyone for listening. As always, God bless you. Keep you in my prayers. Have a great week.